Welcome to the First Presbyterian Church of Englewood, a community committed to live boldly, share boundlessly, grow community, and build God's world. Please visit us in person or at englewoodpres.org.
From the Gospel according to Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner received evil things, but now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." He said, "Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." He said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." Well, that's a tough passage that you may start to wonder how it fits into a series called How to Be Happy. All right, but we're going to get to that, okay? And so we are in week 3 of our 4-week series called How to Be Happy. And, in the previous weeks, in week 1, we talked about attitude. We talked about what it's like to see a world where there is unfairness in a good way, how to see unmerited favor, that sometimes good things happen to people and you don't think that they deserve it, and to see that not with an attitude of resentment, but with an attitude of appreciating that there is unmerited blessing in the world. And we should be grateful to be in a world where unmerited blessing happens, because that's how God treats us. We do not deserve God's favor, but we receive God's favor. And so to see that in the world is a positive thing. Then last week we talked about relationships and just talked about how important relationships are to our future, that when we invest in our relationships, we are truly investing in the most important thing for our future happiness. And that word future is what we're talking about this week. So we're talking about that word future. Now, when we talk about the future, a lot of times people like to say, well, the future is unpredictable. And to some extent, that's true, but it's actually a lot more predictable than we like to think. In fact, that's what all of science is about, is the idea that things are predictable, right? I mean, what would be the point of science if you just sat there and said, well, sometimes we let go of a hammer and it falls, and sometimes it doesn't, right? Science is all about explaining things and figuring things out for the purpose of having things be predictable. And so the world is a lot more predictable than we think. And in fact, it is so predictable in general, that's why the unpredictable things stand out. When the unpredictable things stand out to us and bother us because we like to live in a world where there is a lot of predictability. And so we're going to be talking about that today, but we're going to begin in this story where we have a man named Lazarus. And Lazarus is given the dignity, by the way, in the Bible, just as an aside. One of the things that you'll notice in the Bible is when they choose to relate a person's name and when they don't. All right, so Lazarus is given the dignity of being given a name. So his name is mentioned, and the rich man is not. And that in and of itself is an indicator of priority within the Bible, okay? So the Bible tells you that there is a poor man named Lazarus. He's just covered with sores because he's not getting treated properly. It says he longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. And to understand kind of what's going on there, it was customary at banquets to just think about how wealthy people were. And if you think about the leftover food at banquets that we have today, you kind of get the same idea. But at that time, it was customary for people at a banquet, when their hands, they're eating meat with their hands and stuff, and their hands are getting dirty, it was customary to use bread to wipe their hands and then throw the bread under the table. All right? And so he is basically longing to eat even that if somebody's, meat, fat, soaked bread that they had used to wipe themselves fell under the table, he would have been happy to eat that. So then they both die, and Lazarus goes to, off to the angels. The words heaven, aren't used here, but he goes off. That's the implication. He's off to be comforted by the angels. And the rich man heads off to be tormented. And so the rich man is in Hades being tormented. And if that kind of scares you, so if any of you are sitting there saying, is that me? The really simple answer, the reminder here in Scripture is that is what Jesus saves you from. Okay, and so that is the point, is that is why Jesus, came. And so we are not supposed to, in our faith, be afraid of the future, but rather to have hope in it. And any depiction, any knowledge of that kind of outcome is actually not supposed to be used to scare us, but it should deepen our gratitude to God for saving us from that. Okay, and so we should hear that with an attitude of being grateful that is not what is in our future in Christ. Okay, but moving on from that, what happens is that the lesson here is that the rich man is being tormented, and he asks for the option of having Lazarus. Notice the privilege here, by the way. There's a little minor aside. He said, can you send Lazarus to dip his finger in cool water? It's like he still wants Lazarus to serve him. It's like he still thinks that Lazarus should be comforting him. All right, can you send Lazarus with some water to me? And such rampant privilege, such an attitude that he can't get past. And then failing that, he says, can you send him? He still wants to send Lazarus everywhere. Can you send him to my Father's house? It's like, wow. You didn't pay any attention to him, but you wanted him to serve you the entire time. Send him, now I want you to send him as a messenger to my Father's house, and I want you to warn my brothers so that they don't end up where I'm at. And the answer is no. The answer is no, partly because he said, look, they don't need it. They already have Moses and the prophets. They already have the information that they need, okay? They should have listened. That if they were reading Moses, the law of Moses, reading Torah is what that means. If they're studying Torah, if they're studying the prophets, they have all the information they need. They shouldn't need an additional warning. So basically the upshot here is that he's saying the rich man knew what he needed to know. This should not have been a surprise. The rich man already knew what he needed to know to avoid his fate. He knew it, okay? Because the future is kind of predictable. Because there are consequences to actions. Because we should be able to look at what we're doing, look at what's happening in our lives and say, it's actually kind of logical that if you do this, this will happen. All right? If you do this, this will happen. There are unpredictable things that happen. But more often than not, what happens is a result of what we have chosen to do. Okay? So the question becomes, how do we make better choices? How do we do things in such a way that we can get toward where we want to be in life? And I want to share with you something about my own experience and my own background that has always shaped the way I think about moving into the future. And it's simply this. My training originally was in chemistry. It was in synthetic organic chemistry, okay? And so that's what I did. Actually, I worked in computers with related to that, but my academic training was in synthetic organic chemistry. And in that, where you're trying to make something, it's not like Chopped. You don't just like start with a bunch of chemicals on your desk and say, what can I make with this? Okay? But rather, you started from an end product, something useful, something important, you work backwards. So there is something here. I'll show you a diagram, not expecting you to understand it, but here's one that's online. And this is a pharmaceutical compound in the upper left, and it's got the arrows going backwards. And the one thing you can notice is that at each step, it's becoming simpler. Okay? And so what would happen is that you start with a target molecule. You would start with something that was big and complicated and useful. For example, one of the big ones over the years was a compound called Taxol. And if you know someone who has had breast cancer, then you would be familiar with this drug. It was really big because it was discovered in the early 60s that it was effective against cancer, and it was extracted from the bark of the Pacific yew tree. And the problem was there just aren't enough Pacific yew trees, okay, to treat everybody. So the idea of making it was really important. And so there were groups all over trying to make it, and even after they succeeded in synthesizing it, you tried to make it simpler. You tried to make, because these things go way back many, many, many steps. And so to express it a little more simply, it kind of looks like this. You have a goal, and then you sit there and you say, okay, my goal is this molecule, and if I had A and B, I'm pretty sure I could make that target from A and B, okay? Except I don't have A and I don't have B. So how can I make A? Well, if I had C and D, you're breaking it across on a whiteboard, a blackboard. If I had C and D, I'm pretty sure I could make A. And if I had E and F, I'm pretty sure I could make B. And you kept working down. And in a complex molecule, that might be 27 or 28 layers deep before you finally got to things that you knew how to make because they were in the literature, or things that you could buy. Okay? And so it would go all the way down, like 27, 28 steps, all right, was not uncommon. And that's what people would do. Okay? And so you just broke it down and broke it down and broke it down, starting from this end product. And you started to say, okay, how many times can I break it down and finally get to stuff? Now, the beauty of this is that you start thinking about what are the things that you want. In fact, even as I thought about a church and thought about where we want to be, where we wanted to be in my time here, you think, what are the things that make for a really healthy church? And you sit there and go, well, you need good family ministries. Yes, you need good, small groups. You need these kinds of things. And if you have all those things, you have a pretty vibrant, pretty high-functioning church. And then you sit there and say, okay, but we don't have any of those. So if we don't have any of those, what does it take to start building that? And you start backing all the way down to, okay, here is what we need. All right? It happens in all kinds of things. You can think about it, relationships, right? If you start breaking it down, it would be nice to have that perfect person in your life, but you break it down, and what's the first advice you give your friend who says, I don't have anybody? You sit there and say, you got to meet some people. There's no magic formula, right? But you got to meet some people. You don't meet anybody, you're never going to be able to build up into having your ideal life partner. You got to figure out how to go out and meet some folks, all right? So there's all kinds of things like that. With kids, we do this with kids a lot when it comes to education. When they think about their future and they think about what they want to be, you break it down and say, okay, yes, you may want to be this, but you're not going to get there if you don't make good grades now. If you want to be that, you better make good grades now so that you can go here and then go there and then do this. Or if you want a certain position in life, in employment, you might sit there and say, okay, well then you need the training. How do I get the training? You break it down. Maybe take a course. Maybe get an internship. All these kinds of things. You break it backwards, okay? And I think that this approach helps us in a number of ways. First of all, when you have that image of what you want, all right, then you begin to understand why you're doing it, what you're working toward. See, when you just start with a bunch of stuff and go forward, what I think happens is that it gets confusing. But when you plan your life with a vision of where you want to be, you have a really good idea of why you're doing what you're doing. And you can hold that out and say, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm doing it to move me toward that. Okay? So, as I said, in thinking about what the church does, and you work back these different areas that are necessary to have a well-functioning church, you go down and you break these things down and you sit there and say, okay, this is really important over here because it moves me up the chain. It gets me closer, all right? If we do this, it gets us closer. You can do things that don't get you closer, because we're going to do things that don't really advance our interests at all. It's called recreation, all right? All right, so you can do things that don't do that, but you need to understand which are the things that are helping you get closer to your goal and which are the things that aren't. And you need to understand that the things that aren't getting you closer, that aren't moving you up one of the legs of your path to where you want to be, are things that you can let go of. And then when you're just looking at where you are and saying, okay, this is where I am, this is my circumstance, this is what I have, I don't know where to go, it's bewildering. See, when you look forward from where you are, there's a bewildering number of possibilities. All right? I don't know where to go. I mean, can you imagine, GPSs are great. I love GPS, I love Google Maps. Can you imagine going on Google Maps and just saying, here's where I am, take me somewhere. Right? And yet I know a lot of people who actually kind of live their life that way. They're where they are and they go, I don't know what to do next. And then the answer is, well, where do you want to go? And they're like, I don't know. Let's figure that out first. All right? Google Maps is completely useless if you can't type a destination in. There's a bewildering number of possibilities. Because if Google Maps could really talk back at you and you said, I don't know where to go, it would go, well, I can take you anywhere. I can take you anywhere, but you got to tell me. You got to give me a clue. On the other hand, when you start from where you are and you work backwards, as you're working down those legs and saying, in order to be where I want to be, I need this in my life, I need this in my life, I need this in my life, and I'm going to work backwards down through steps. First of all, you understand that getting there is a complicated process. You begin to understand that you're not just going to do everything in one layer. It would be really nice if you could do it in one leap, but you can't. To get to anything worthwhile, it's going to be step after step after step after step. And you start to break it down because you're going to sit there and say, I want to be here, and then what do I need to be here? Well, I need these things. And you go, well, I don't have those things, so what do I need to get those things? And you break it down, you realize it's going to be a process. But the other thing that brings you hope in the midst of that, even though that sounds daunting, is that as you work through it, there was something we always understood in the laboratory. Looking backward, there's a lot of options to get there. See, what would happen is that as you were working through that, you'd sit there and you'd hit a roadblock. You worked through that plan all the way to the bottom, and you mapped it out, and then you start building it going forward. And one of the things that you had mapped out on the board that you thought was going to work just didn't. It happened all the time. You sat there and said, on the board, it looked like, yes, that if I had A and B, it would make C. That should happen, and then you actually did it, and it didn't. And you realized, well, but there's another way. I'm now going to look for a different way to make C. Okay? So when you work backwards and you go down those roads, you sit there and say, okay, I've got more than one option here. These are the things that I need. Here's what I need to get the things I need, and here's what I need to get those things. And you work back down, but then you realize through that when you hit a roadblock, you can find another way to get to where you want to go. So when you have that destination fixed in your mind, you understand that there are a lot of options to get you there. And you begin to understand that some of these detours, some of these things in your life that didn't work out, where you thought that to get to where you wanted to be, you had already accomplished this step and you were ready for the next step, and somehow that next step just blows up in your face, and you sit there and you think, yeah, okay, it did. But that doesn't mean I can't get to where I want to be. It just means I'm going to have to find a different path to get there. And so instead of being bewildered by the number of possibilities, when you break it down from where you want to get to, you realize there's more than one path to get there. And it may take longer. You may have to back down a few steps in order to work around it. That happened to us all the time in the lab. You sat there because a research team, what would be happening is you had these things you needed and you were working on basically working on different legs of that pathway to assemble the things that you needed, all right? And that's what you had group meetings for. You get together and you're reporting the results that you're having and you're realizing that this one leg isn't going to work. So you find another way to do it. But because you still had that destination in mind, you knew that there was a way to get there. You'd figure it out. You would just break it down differently, analyze it differently, and still realize you were going to get to where you wanted to be. So at no point in your difficulties did you lose hope. In the midst of the roadblocks, in the midst of the detours, you still retained the hope that I can still get to that next step. There's a different way to break it down. There's a different way to move forward. And once I get that building block in place, I can keep going. It was really important. And then it helps you understand where to put your energy. You got to prioritize the things that moved you up a step. That in that layer going down, you sat there and said, it was a great piece of accomplishment when you sat there and said, okay, I've solved it. I've made it to this next level in the chain of things I need. There's a great sense of accomplishment. And so as you were going along, you said, okay, I've done it. The same way we celebrate, right? We celebrate a high school diploma. A high school diploma does not make you a physician. But if you want to be a physician, you better have a high school diploma. And so you realize you get it, and you start, and you're moving. You're moving along the path you need to get to, and it feels hopeful, it feels optimistic. So you start moving forward. And you try not to put your energy too wholly into things that don't move you along that path. It keeps you focused. And that focus is something that we kind of have a sense for. You know, in our passage, right, Abraham says to the rich man, he says, look, if they don't listen, they're not going to listen to something else. It's not, you seem to think that the problem was the messenger. It's like, no, if they don't listen now, they're not going to listen to something else. They've got the information they need, but they're not listening. I'm pretty convinced, because I'm convinced because of my own life as opposed to your life. Maybe your life is different. But I know in my life, most of the bad decisions that I made that had negative future consequences for me, I kind of knew were bad decisions when I made them. Yeah. I kind of knew it. But we like to ignore it, right? Like those warning labels on cigarette packs. Yeah. People would see them all the time. And they ignored them all the time. All right. Most of the time I knew. I just thought that somehow I was exempt from the consequences of my bad actions. It's called being a teenager. All right? Because the central part of being a teenager is believing that the predictable bad consequences of your behavior are something that will only happen to someone else. You only hope that that starts to go away. I'm still waiting. But they don't listen. See, from the perspective of your destination, if you look at your life from the perspective of that destination you want to achieve, and you break everything down going backwards, I'm pretty sure of one thing. You already know what the future you wants you to do right now. See, I think future you is waiting at that destination and looking back at you right now. And future you knows what you should do to move yourself closer to that destination. And I think you already know what future you is advising you. I think you already know what future you is rooting for as you face choices in your life. Future you is saying, you know that's what you need to do, just do it. And we're sitting there saying, but I'm afraid to do it. I'm scared to do it. It's going to be hard to do it. And future you is saying, you got to do it, and you know it. Do it already. The information we need is generally already there. And it's especially clear when we think in terms of where we want to be and work backwards to how we're going to get there. It becomes even clearer that we know what moves us down a path that ends at the destination and what moves us down a path that can't. And occasionally that gets muddied. Occasionally you'll hit a roadblock that you weren't expecting, right? Because we all know that there's always that time when you're following the directions and a tree fell across the road that you were supposed to go down, and you've got to back up and find a new way around it. That will happen. But generally, from where we are to where we want to be, we know what gets us closer. It's just a matter of deciding to do it. And next week, in the conclusion of our series, we're going to talk about, in very simple terms, the extent to which we don't choose a worthy destination for ourselves. So we hope that you'll be here for week 4 of How to Be Happy.